Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Climate Talks podcast. The climate is talking. Hope you're listening. We have a guest today. This is our first guest. So I'm Sam, as always, here in the Digital Humanities Center in the basement of Love Library, and I am joined by Judy. Thank you for joining us today, Judy.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Yeah, so you've been on the Climate Talks team for like a couple years, right?
Yeah.
And you're our first guest on the podcast, but you're super familiar with what we've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
So you're a fellow PhD student.
Yeah.
What got you into geography and wanting to be a PhD student?
Yeah, that's a really great question. A little bit about my background. I was a sustainability student here at San Diego State in my undergrad, and after that, I joined the Peace Corps.
Oh, no way. Okay.
Yeah, so I did the Peace Corps. We did get evacuated during COVID, but I was there for almost a year. My service was in Panama, and that's kind of how it all got started because I wanted to be an environmental science teacher and educator.
Okay.
But it ended up working out that I was a sustainable agriculture systems volunteer, and I was freaking out a little bit because I was like, I don't know the first thing about agriculture, and they were like, don't worry about it, we'll teach you.
Cool.
And I actually got involved with this really cool project with indigenous Panamanian people, and it's sort of in northern Panama by the border of Costa Rica, and that's a really big coffee growing region and industry.
Delicious.
So what they do is something called agroforestry, and that's kind of the mixture of perennials with crops. So having like a tree canopy story, and also a particular crop. So what they were doing was they had their natural teak growing there, and then the understory for the coffee really likes shade.
Okay.
So they were planting coffee and banana and cacao and having like a really intermixed cash crop business. So that was what really got me involved with all this project. And then after the Peace Corps and after that project was finished, we were able to connect people with a nonprofit that sold their coffee at a much higher price. They were essentially getting very ripped off.
You had studied sustainability, then you did the Peace Corps in Panama.
Yeah.
And then were there for a little bit. For how long were you staying in Panama?
I was there for almost a year.
Okay. And then COVID strikes.
Yeah.
You moved back to U.S.
Yeah.
Got into grad school. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. So, I'm always interested to hear people's stories about what got them into environmental studies or geography. Because I think a lot of people have that like aha moment or that class or some kind of book, or usually it's a teacher in a class where you're like, oh, wow, geography connects all these different things. Like you're talking about like the actual landscape and how the farm worked.
Yeah.
And then you're thinking about how the plants grow, how it's being marketed in the international system. So it's like this really broad view. You can study so many different angles of an issue.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what gravitated me to geography. I did want to continue my studies at some point in my life. There wasn't a sustainability, but sustainability is really housed very well under geography. And then my current advisor was also a Peace Corps volunteer. She was also an agriculture volunteer. And really, she was working with a lot of pasture lands in Tanzania and Africa. So we had a lot in common. We had a very similar background within like these very like intermixed cropping systems. So we really had a lot of focus on that. We can talk a little bit about the climate benefits of agroforestry, but that's basically what me and my PhD advisor are talking about is sort of how agroforestry can mitigate climate impacts.
Okay, so this is good. So, we'll get into that. So the thing that I think of when I teach, so I've been teaching like U.S. geography, I taught California geography. One of the things that I've noticed especially in the United States, is that we you see a lot of landscapes and a lot of different forms of producing crops that have become really dependent on fossil fuels. And so there's like a long history there. There's like the introduction of fertilizers and pesticides and mechanizing. So, instead of going out there with an ox and you're pulling a plow, you have a tractor. All of that really started to change, like historically around World War II, especially World War I and World War II. There's a lot of industrial processes during the war that then gets sort of promoted into different communities for different applications for all this machinery and chemicals that was being produced for war, and it started to be like used in more civilian agricultural contexts just in like the last 50, 75, 100 years. And then you also see, like, even earlier than that, people shipping out things like coffee and bananas that are grown in the tropics, and then once there was more ability to ship those and process them, and different types of like canning techniques, so all of those things became more mechanized, more industrial, and burning a lot more fossil fuel to make it less labor intensive, to help grow it, and just to ship it around faster and easier, right? And so that's sort of the extremely brief crash course history on, for millennia, people had been growing food and stuff without really burning much fossil fuels, and in like the last 100 years, we started burning a lot. That's sort of the crash course. That's the role in the food systems. It's burning a lot of fuels. There's also the issue of converting a lot of sort of natural landscapes, grasslands, wetlands into fields. So they formerly had like a forest, which you would probably see in Panama. You're converting forest into cropland. You're losing all that biodiversity. You're losing that landscape's ability to sequester carbon. And obviously, any animal that has that habitat there will be killed or extirpated. And so, when it comes to the case of Panama and what you've seen down there, what you learned, what you're researching now, because you're still like in your early days of your PhD, what do you think is the that intersection of the agriculture there and the agroforestry and climate? How do you see that?
Yeah. So Panama has a really interesting history. It's very extensive, but what I gathered is that Panama was one of the big countries that was targeted by the United Fruit Company, the quote-unquote banana republics. So the United Fruit Company still has a really strong foothold on Panamanian agriculture. They're now known as Chiquita. They're a really recognized fruit company.
Yeah.
And essentially, Panama became a colony for this American company. And that's basically how a lot of problems started. They started clear-cutting a lot of forested land.
So this would be old growth forests, right? Like massive trees, hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
We have extremely diverse canopy. You have animals living all the way from top to bottom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. An extremely diverse canopy. All of the biodiversity that you can imagine. It's one of the biggest ecological hotspots in the world.
In the tropics, right?
In the tropics. And so, yeah, that was one of like the big impacts in history of the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company did end up leaving that particular region of Bocas del Toro in Panama because it was really flood prone. So once the United Fruit Company left, there was a lot of chaos that ensued. And so that's when coffee kind of started settling in and creating a home there because it was a little bit more, it was better suited for growing coffee. So that was how coffee started growing in that region and sort of remains their main source of cash to this day. As far as how agriculture is being impacted and how that impacts climate, food needs to be grown in some way or another. And agroforestry is a really ancient practice. It goes as far back as the beginnings of agriculture. And really the idea is to create a system that mimics a natural forest. So you're really maximizing your space, whether that's sort of on a layer basis. So you start with your low-lying crops, and then you have a sort of medium height bush or brush, and then you have your taller trees that are providing a shade and a canopy. and as that's happening sort of on a height basis, that's also happening underground as well. So you kind of have these basically like shallow root structures that sort of lay on your top soil levels, and then you have plants that have more of a tap root or more of a deeper root. So it really is about, intensifying all sorts of agricultural aspects and not just creating a monocrop, which is kind of where all of like the sort of convenience of adding fossil fuels and machinery and all of that came in. But it's also much more diverse ecologically, and that has its challenges.
Right.
It's much more labor intensive to manage a much more diverse agricultural landscape. But
yeah, so just to give you more, to give the listener more background, like monoculture would be like if you're from the Midwest or parts of California, you'll see long rows of like corn, long rows of whatever, strawberries, something like that. That's easy for a machine to go in and spray herbicides and pesticides to have a corn, especially to have that combine just come in and just scoop it all out. Some vegetables like cucumber or like I said, strawberry, those would have to be harvested by hand because they're so fragile. But in general, when you have monoculture, huge swaths of acres, just all the same crop, you can run a machine that goes out there and harvest everything. Now, with organic agriculture, you're not spraying those herbicides, they're pesticides, but you have more work that has to be done, more hand labor, and you're going to be usually seeing organic agriculture with that monocrop. It would be more like you're talking, hopefully more like that. Okay, cool. So that's a sort of quick primer on the agroforestry. And it's cool that you're actually thinking about the soil health. I think that's something people forget about how, like I've talked on the podcast how thin the atmosphere is. And think about how thin our layer of topsoil is, how fragile that is. It takes centuries, if not millennia, to accumulate. We want it to have good health, have diversity inside the soil, which you do not see in monoculture, right? Okay, so you're looking at top to bottom. And then like to speak more concretely, so like would you see like herbs and lettuce on the bottom and then like shrubs and berries in the sort of shrub mid-height? Okay.
Yeah, agroforestry and a lot of what we're learning is really it's about adapting to your environment. So everything is going to have a different climate, a different topography, a different water availability. So it's really about customizing your setting. You can also include animals in all of this. So that is like an added layer or dimension to all of this. So, but yeah, typically how you would structure it would be something that really benefits you. So something, if you really want to maximize your space, you're going to have a low-lying crop that is more shade adapted and a higher top crop that can handle a little bit more heat, can sort of take on a little bit more of that extreme weather and sort of shelter your more sensitive crops.
Okay. Yeah, and that's something I've been gardening for a couple years, and I noticed that too. Like if I go out there and spray a bunch of pesticides and herbicides to kill bugs that are eating my vegetables, I just have way less different birds coming in. I don't see predatory insects. But if I just kind of let it play out and plant native crops or plant native plants here, I'll see native birds. I'll see predatory insects. Like I see a much broader food web when I'm letting the system kind of closely resemble nature. It's never going to be exactly that because I'm growing food that I'm going to eat. But so you think that's sort of
that's exactly that's sort of like exactly it. That's kind of the basis or the premise of this entire idea is just creating a system that can sort of support itself or have the least amount of human input as possible.
Okay. All right. And then the coffee. So what I love coffee. The little that I know about it is that it tends to be, like you said, in the shade. It tends to grow high in elevation, right? So what is that where you're looking at? Like Panama, I think it's a pretty mountainous region, mountainous country. What is it like way up there in like the forests and the cloud forests?
Yeah. So it is it is a zone that does have like a higher than average elevation. Coffee is one of those crops that humans really love and very highly depend on.
Yeah, it's like go-go juice.
Human go-go juice, exactly. So, there are different qualities of coffee and different zones that are able to grow those very high-quality, high-end coffees. So I was in a region that perhaps didn't have the best altitude.
Okay.
And that did impact the coffee growth because people want to do the coffee that produces, the most or is the most expensive in the industry, but maybe that's not quite suited for it. So that was one of the main challenges, was sort of finding a variety that was suited for the climate that we did experience. So we did have the right temperature, we did have the right type of soil, but elevation wasn't quite there.
So was it like a 2,000 feet elevation, something like that? Or if you know offhand, I was just curious.
Yeah, I think we were about 1,000 feet above sea level.
Okay.
And sort of your sweet spot for those high quality coffees is about 2,000 feet.
Okay. So I was just guessing, I know a tiny bit about the history of coffee. It comes from Ethiopia originally. Mm-hmm. The myth is, or story or legend is that a farmer was way up there in the mountains around that area. His goats were eating something off of this bush and they started kicking all around all through the night. And so he realized, we can roast these berries and turn them into a drink. Whenever that happened, I don't know. But I know that coffee originally comes from that highland environment. It likes warm, but not too warm, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a really, that you got to hit that sweet spot, like you said. But on the other side, when you go to market it, I guess we can get into that. The marketing, there's cheap coffee, there's expensive coffee, there's fair trade, et cetera. But what were they seeing in terms of what was available to that exact space and that location? Was it changing from climate change? More extreme weather patterns, more droughts, more rain. What were you noticing?
Yeah, so I think that they weren't experiencing any issues relating to climate in particular, but more so availability. So one of the biggest challenges was accessibility. Okay. It was a really remote site, so everything had to be shipped out via boats. Wow. Sort of, like those good old-fashioned like pull motorboats kind of thing. Okay. So everything had to be exported out, and that was a really costly process. Yeah. And because not everyone has boats, not everyone is hiking, 45-pound sacks of coffee beans on their back from their farms. So
yeah, that's tough work.
Yeah, it was definitely really tough work. So the community kind of rallied together and was able to get a truck of shipment that took it to a fair trade environment. That nonprofit actually was pretty good. Was a really good connection because sort of the market value for that coffee was about $30 for about a 5-gallon bucket. That's how they measure their coffee is just 5-gallon buckets. So that was the market price. Previous to that nonprofit stepping in, they were selling that 5-gallon bucket for about $10.
Wow. Okay.
So that was more costly to them than they were actually profiting from them, because it's quite labor intensive to peel the coffee and ferment it and dry it. Sort of the whole coffee processing side of it all. Okay. Very, very labor intensive.
For sure. And that would all be from those big like sacks that you might see in like a coffee commercial or something. That's what they're producing, and they're shipping it down to, I guess, like a distribution center. Yeah. And it hasn't been roasted. It obviously hasn't been turned into a hot cup coffee yet.
No.
Okay.
No. We're just talking about just the raw peeled bean. Yeah. So at that sort of processing side, they were able to sell it at $25 once transportation costs were included. So much closer to market price, but not quite there yet.
Okay. So it sounds like that was a really good introduction for you and Were you able to see, like, here's an example of an agroforestry coffee plantation and some that were just like monoculture or more, that were less organic, I guess? Were you able to compare, or what were you noticing for the coffee in the agroforestry setting?
Yeah, I think that the biggest and the best way to respond to that was that the people that were incorporating coffee in agroforestry, they were also incorporating plans for their livelihoods. So they were able, because you can't live off coffee, unfortunately, as much as we try. So people were able to incorporate their cattle, their chickens. They were able to have grazing lands. They were also able to incorporate some of, like, those big crops that they would eat on a daily basis. They were able to incorporate plantains, taro root. They were also adding citruses, avocados, and then another source of livelihood, which was that teak that was shading the coffee. So,
Okay.
In terms of market value, not that much, but in terms of livelihood, all of the difference. Whereas plantations that are just rows and rows of coffee, obviously the coffee might have a little bit more care, a little bit more procedure, some better pruning practices, perhaps, because it's much more dedicated. But it's a market that's specifically dedicated to coffee.
Gotcha. And so people would actually be able to not only sell some of the other products that they were producing, like the teak and the citrus, they could have some on the dinner table, right? Like, that's another huge benefit.
Exactly. And, that's sort of the big point as far as, like, livelihood is, if you have a crop that fails for a particular year, you're not really sure what's going to happen with climate. You're not really sure what's going to happen with pests. There might be a flood that impacts your entire culture. So having more variety, having different things that could potentially be suited for different climates is also a really great backup plan.
For sure. And I think there's a long history of that in Latin America, especially in the Andes Mountains, like in Peru. Like, I know that there would be potatoes adapted to each different elevation, and this particular spot is going to grow different things just in case there is that flood or that hailstorm or whatever, because you're high in elevation. You want to have that, like, those backup crops for food, for sure.
Yeah.
Have you seen, I think that Panama is in a drought right now, or it's been, what I know is that the Panama Canal, which uses a reservoir system to release fresh water into the lock system to raise and lower boats, and that reservoir has had less rain than it normally does. So I think that's impacting shipping. Had you seen any of that back then or since?
I think when I was in Panama, we were in a particularly rainy year. So I didn't quite experience that. But what you're saying is very true. I haven't followed up to see how that's been impacting growers. I know in certain other areas of Panama that have more grassy rangeland, that was a big issue for them, particularly for, like, their cattle and their crops, because that's a lot more water intensive. And if they're not getting that rain, then that became more of a challenge. But since I was in a much more tropical sort of ecological region, I didn't see the impact of drought specifically. Gotcha. I have seen that here in San Diego, though. So
okay, yeah, I was going to ask. So have you done any different research or similar research in San Diego, or where are you at in what you're studying and what?
Yeah, another case study that I've been doing, and that's kind of the sort of center of my research. Panama was more personal experience, work experience.
Gotcha.
And so San Diego is now sort of like my academic focus. So it's been sort of a really intensive case study of San Diego agriculture, its impacts of drought and extreme heat, and also a more sort of physical assessment of what's actually going on between agriculture crops and that heat.
Okay, so you had the more, like, human economic side, and now you're shifting to the more physical, the biophysical. Cool.
Yeah, exactly. So sort of the big focus of my master's was interviews and surveys on particular sets of challenges that agriculture and growers are facing in San Diego County. Primarily, that is drought.
Wow.
Sort of like the big determinant factor in San Diego County is water, and that's sort of a big issue, and it's kind of on everybody's minds.
Yeah, it feels weird to say that today because it's rainy and we were both walking to campus in the rain. But yeah, for a drought, because all in our Mediterranean climate, we have that rainy season right now, from like late end of the year, November to like now, March. That's kind of the only time it's going to rain.
Yeah.
So if we miss some of those rain events, we miss like 30, 40, 50 or worse % of our annual rainfall, right?
Exactly.
So the drought can happen just quicker than you would imagine. Okay. And then what were the sort of growers and people saying? Like, what were some of your? I didn't get to attend your master's defense or anything, so I don't know what you were finding.
No, that's all good. You're probably better off for it. But yeah, sort of the big findings was we really focused on perennials in San Diego County, and that's going to include your avocados. San Diego County is the biggest avocado growing in country. If you're not, yeah. Okay. If you're not including like all of the avocados that are shipped in from Mexico.
Did not know that.
Yeah, and then we're also one of the biggest citrus and apple and grape growers also in the country.
So the trees and the vines, especially.
Trees and vines. So that both of those are included in a category called perennials, and those are your plants that are going to come back year after year. So they do have a seasonal cycle, but the end of their life is not 1 year. Right.
And then so that contrasts with an annual plant, something like, I don't know, like a basil plant or something that's just you plant the seed, it grows up and turns into leaves and turns into, it bolts, as we say, and produces a seed head. That's it. And that all happens within one growing season, so that's an annual.
Yes,
typically
exactly.
Like lettuce, herbs, smaller plants, anything that's like a fruit or citrus, those are... Okay.
Those are going to be your perennials.
Okay.
And so, yeah, what we found, which we didn't really know about, was that avocado has a really specific temperature threshold, and sort of like the physiological response that it has to an extreme heat. And we actually were able to get really specific with it, and we found out that sort of at Fahrenheit, it would be 104 degrees. That is when the Hass avocado, so like that species,
okay,
it just kind of drops their entire fruit and their entire production.
Wow.
So it's very drastic. We saw a lot of images for it. It basically looks like one of our farmers described it as like if someone took a flame torch and just torched the entire tree.
Okay.
So their leaves immediately brown or gray, and then all of the fruit falls on the ground. And then California has some very strict laws about fruits falling on the ground, so it is an entire production lost if you sort of surpass that threshold, and then those plants aren't able to adapt to those climates.
Okay, so the tree just kind of hits the threshold. It's like, I'm out, I'm done. It drops its leaves and it drops its fruit, and you cannot go on and sell the avocados in California.
Nope.
You can't sell them at all.
You can't sell them at all.
Wow. So what do they just kind of have to let it rot then, right?
Yeah, compost, if you can kind of handle that. You can also just let it mulch your ground,
right.
Which it's a really good practice. And any kind of leaf or dry matter, just leave it around your trees. It does some good things for the soil.
Yeah, it'll biodegrade, and it has nutrients that will then help the plant that it's coming from.
Exactly.
And then, do the trees bounce back once it cools off?
Yeah, so they do tend to bounce back, depending on the severity of sort of the extreme heat event. One farmer talked about 30% of the entire biomass of his farm had to be like cut down because it was just not able to be salvaged. So you do have to like prune your tree pretty heavily afterwards.
Okay. So those branches are not only dropping leaves, dropping fruit, they will be damaged the tree itself, like 7 out of 10 might survive, but the rest just couldn't survive that heat wave.
Yeah, exactly. And the older a tree is, the more susceptible it is.
Really? I would think the opposite.
Yeah. Avocados are a really interesting plant in that sort of as younger trees are sort of bushier, so it can sort of shield itself from like, the heat and the wind. So someone was saying that that's sort of like the killer combination was like heat, wind, sort of like our Santa Ana winds that happen seasonally.
Which we talked about on the pod.
Yes. Hashtag ad. So it's basically like taking a heat, like a hairdryer, and sort of like blowing. So if you have a bushier plant, you're able to withstand a little bit more heat versus like a more scattered or grown out or branched out tree is going to take in more intense heat towards like its more separated branches.
Okay. Yeah, you'll see that in a lot of desert adapted plants. They'll be small. They'll have small leaves. They'll have hairy leaves sometimes. They have all these different adaptations. Sometimes the color will be lighter, so it can not absorb as much heat and sunlight. And I think avocados come from central Mexico, give or take, originally.
So that there's been a lot of conversations, sometimes very heavy conversations with farmers about sort of the feasibility of continuing to grow avocados in this region. Sort of the competition is really steep with Mexican imports, and also the water availability is because you're essentially watering a tropical plant. So
right.
There's a lot of thought that needs to happen when you're planning and creating an orchard is how much water you're actually going to have and able to sustain. So a lot of them are shifting towards grapes, which are a more Mediterranean plant, and are bringing in a lot of industry, a lot of agritourism, a lot of wine tasting. So that has been one of the biggest shifts for farmers in the region.
Okay. So they would use pretty intensive irrigation, like pipes and water going out to pretty much every tree in an avocado plantation or orchard, whatever. And then grapes, still you're going to irrigate them, but maybe not as much water is needed because they're adapted to this Mediterranean climate.
Exactly. And that's sort of another focus and aspect of the research is the way that you're irrigating your crops.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I've been harping on. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So avocados, not only them being a tropical plant, they're also extremely sensitive to salt, which San Diego, it's coastal.
Okay.
There's going to be salt in the soil.
Yeah,
so what you need to do is essentially when you're irrigating, that salt tends to pool up next to the tree roots. So what you need to do is backwash it. So not only are you irrigating once, you also have to like wash out the salt from the soil. So that is a very hefty amount of water that you're using. Grapes tend to be irrigated more on a drip basis. That's what I've seen mostly, and that's sort of the hype word that everybody here in Southern California is using. I mean, it is a personal preference on what you're choosing to grow or what market you're going into, but a lot of people are shifting drastically.
Yeah, I was saying that I harp on it because it's like there are little simple changes we could make to our irrigation. Like if you have a lawn and you water it in the middle of the day, most of that's going to evaporate. Or I've even seen people, I'm not even kidding, in LA and San Diego, watering their lawns during the rain. I've seen that multiple times. So there's craziness that happens with irrigation. And it's like if you just watered it a different time of day or more on top of it, you would use less water and your bill would be lowered. So there are simple, low investment things we could do in our homes and in agriculture. But so where are they getting the water from that's going out there and irrigating their fields here in San Diego? It's pretty dry. So what's up with that?
A lot of people have wells in their properties. So that is a really large initial investment that people are using is groundwater wells. And sort of the entire pumping systems, those irrigation systems are about 6 figures for what I've heard. So very, very costly investment. Some of them are using city water that comes from different places. But mostly it's groundwater within properties.
Okay. So the city water in Southern California, some of it comes from the Colorado River. I guess we have local smaller reservoirs as well, and the California Aqueduct, the LA Aqueduct, that are just pumping water down from the Sierra Nevadas, melting their snow, basically.
Yeah.
And that brings me to my next question, which is, so you have this big investment cost to get some kind of, if you want to set up a farm, if you want to set up an agriculture business, you have to think about where you're getting your water. You have to think about what's your regimen to get these plants not only growing and healthy, but productive and profitable, hopefully, and delicious and healthy and all that. Is the changing climate and these more frequent heat waves, which I'm just throwing that out there, I don't even see the data, I assume it's happening, is that kind of changing who's able to grow food and who's able to stay in this business?
Yeah. So San Diego is a really interesting case study for this particular question, because that was the assumption that we had initially was, the climate's getting more and more extreme. We're seeing longer, more frequent drought periods, things like that.
So that is true. I was assuming
that
that's
is
the case.
true.
Okay.
Yes, very true, tested, proven. We ran a climate model. It's one of its major outputs was by 2050 could be looking like a regular year around 2050 could be looking like 2014, which has been our hottest, driest year on record ever in San Diego. So 25 years from now, extreme drought, basically. That was one of our biggest inputs and challenges. But San Diego farmers have been dealing with drought for a really long time. So they're kind of prepared for what's coming. They know their water sources better than anyone I've ever heard of, maybe even better than some politicians.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yes. So they really know the environment that they're working with and the sources that they have. However, one of the biggest challenges to agriculture and adaptation is one that's very common throughout the country, and that's sort of the age of farmers.
Yeah.
So, we were thinking, how do you feel about, the climate? It's changing. And they're like, I'm going to be dead in 2050.
Yeah.
I'm 80-something years old. So that was one of the biggest challenges in San Diego County. And not only that, it's sort of also about land use costs here in San Diego. We have beautiful weather. People want to move here.
Oh, yeah.
And so, we've lost about 15% of land since 2010 for agricultural land.
Of
so,
the arable land that could go to agriculture is going to something else. Probably a parking lot or an ugly cookie-cutter subdivision.
An Amazon warehouse. No, that's actually a big problem.
Okay.
Pretty much everywhere in California is.
I think it's nationally. You have a lot of farmers getting older, very, very few people joining that industry.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't see that globally, though, because a lot of people, especially in less developed economies, they're going to be growing a lot of their own food at every age.
Oh, absolutely. So when we were sort of running these that's sort of a big issue with climate science, is that it's looking years ahead, and people are thinking about now. People in agriculture are thinking about, is it going to rain tomorrow? Is it going to rain next week? How do I adjust my irrigation? I don't really care about a 50-year forecast because I'm not really sure what's going to happen. My children don't want to take over my lands, my business, my practice. So, we're thinking about selling the property. We're thinking about other families. So, I think that there's sort of a pretty significant disconnect between the climate science that's being outputted and sort of the climate needs of people.
Yeah. Is that something you hope to use your grad studies and your kind of bridge that gap between these complicated, hard to access scientific papers and then what are actual people on the ground who need information about weather and climate doing? Is that something you're looking into?
Definitely. Okay. We were pretty surprised because in our survey, word of mouth and weather channels were actually the main source of climate information for even growers in San Diego County. Yeah, there's so much good science that's happening. There's so much work and effort that's being done. But is it reaching those like target audiences? And that's sort of like a big question that I think about a lot.
Yeah. I mean, that you could do your whole life's work on that alone, right?
Yeah.
One thing that's got me curious, though, so, I mean, I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio. That's like farm for most of the state is just fields as far as you can see. Typical image of a farmer, like you said, is a little bit older. They may not necessarily be thinking about climate change in this like intense political way that it usually is thought of, right? And then also, you know, it's just tends to be more conservative in that region anyway. But what about in California? You know, it's this West Coast. There's sort of a different mentality, but a lot of these people are business owners or whatever. So did you sense, like, when you're doing interviews and talking to people, did you sense any kind of like reluctance to engage with this idea of climate change? Or does that group of people tend to be like more open to it because they're dealing with it, like you said, like pretty often?
Yeah, so our typical demographic, I think we had sort of 60% male, and sort of our average age was 61, 62 years old.
Wow.
So our demographic, even here in San Diego County, did tend to lean a little bit more conservative. Things like climate change sort of iffed out a little bit for some people. So we were talking about extreme weather, and sort of that became a neutral term that was still specific enough.
Okay.
But on the other hand, we did have a handful of young farmers that were sort of looking to get into the industry, and most of the work that they do is ecological conservation and educational. So they are bringing those features into their farm, and sort of one good thing that they get to do is they get to start from scratch, and they get to start with a lot of information on the table. So if they're thinking about a long-term business plan, they do have all that information available. So they are adding infrastructure. They're adding, you know, sort of like these tree canopy structures, things preventatively, so in case the weather shifts or becomes more extreme, something that will not impact their business wholly or fully. They're really investing in sort of diversifying their farms so that...
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be closer to what we described from the beginning, those agroforestry. It's more of a holistic system.
Yeah.
It's more resilient. That's the word you hear people say a lot. It might be too early to say, but what, other than age or whatever people's background, is there something that kind of sparks their interest in, like, hey, I'm going to have a more adapted, more climate, what was the word, climate smart agriculture system on my farm here compared to this other thing that's kind of just like the old way of doing things? Like what causes a person to lean that way? Do you think it's age? Is it something else too?
I mean, I think it's really interesting and sort of a difficult question to answer as sort of a human geographer. You know, you have a lot of people doing different things, and why they're doing those things are really difficult to answer. But I think it is a genuine care and passion for the environment. Like your San Diego farmer is gonna live very close to their land, so they want land that is good. They want land that is healthy. They want land that is like not riddled with pesticides. So I think it's really like an intuitive sort of action to like care for your own land that surrounds you, and that's a really great part of farming that I think is less talked about. We had some challenges speaking to farmers because farmers tend to be sort of, villainized as like spraying chemicals left and right. And I think that there is like a much deeper care for the environment. And that's what's stealing sort of like a growth in sort of like these regenerative climate smart practices is just like a change in agriculture.
Yeah. I think you and I have actually talked about that. And I I'll admit I've been guilty of villainizing certain farming practices. Spraying herbicides, indiscriminately spraying pesticides, it has a really negative effect on watersheds, on soil, on the plant itself, on the farm workers, especially if they're out there spraying it. That's a whole other conversation. But that's something that I've noticed. Just there's a really broad range, and it's hard to generalize. It's hard to summarize. That's especially what we do in human geography is we're like disaggregating, to use that big word. Like you're looking at a group and just calling them like farmers in San Diego. Well, what does that group consist of, and how are people different within that group, and what are their attitudes and what are their practices? So that's good to hear that there's actually more willingness to do things differently, to live close to the land. So the thing that you and I had talked about, which was that when I went into the archive and was researching on what's been done in the Fort McDermott Reservation in northern Nevada, I stumbled on a declassified document from the 1950s where they were kind of testing out ways to clear the range of the native sagebrush in order to graze cattle and to grow hay, alfalfa. What they did was they were like, oh, we have this new herbicide. You can spray it from an airplane, and it just kills all the sagebrush. Then once that's done, you can let your cattle graze there and your sheep graze there or whatever. And the herbicide, and they said the chemical name for it, 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, that's Agent Orange. They were testing out Agent Orange on native reservations in the 1950s, spraying it from the skies. Not really with anybody's permission. So it was kind of thrusted onto these marginalized communities in that time. And so when I talk about, like, I don't want to vilify farmers, but there is that connection between, really ecologically harmful practices and the military-industrial complex and these chemicals like Agent Orange that were tested out in the U.S. and then used in a warfare context in South Korea and Korean Peninsula and in Vietnam. All of these things are connected and moving away from that chemical intensive, that fossil fuel heavy, that using airplanes, using big tractors. Hopefully that's sort of the old way of doing agriculture, and we're shifting to more climate smart, climate sensitive practices. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. So where exactly in the county or the city have you been looking at?
Yeah, so most of the farms are centralized in the northwest portion of the county, around Escondido, Fallbrook, Paula. Those are going to be your big farming practices where most of the perennials happen. There are so many farms in the county. There's over 5,000 farms, which is...
Wow.
Yeah, okay. I think that most of them are less than 10 acres, so you're really small farms. Okay. If you compare that nationally.
Way smaller. Yeah, most farmers back in the plains and Midwest would be like 10 times that for their farm. Okay. Yeah. Do those extend into the desert? So it's pretty much everywhere if it's 5,000 farms.
Yeah, some of them are technically in sort of the Colorado desert region. So there's a lot of farms in Julian, and that's technically desert region. But most of them are going to focus around that sort of like coastal inland region where they're going to get a little bit of like that morning fog that sort of helps with like the cooling and all of that.
Okay. Now, do you see, so that's all the production. That's how we adapt to the changing climate, how do we think about the whole system and use hopefully less chemicals and fuels. The other side would be like what we talked about with coffee. Once you have that finished product, that crop, whatever it is there a push to not ship that so far away and try to find more local markets so that we're burning less fuel, sending it, to a grocery store, hopefully, whatever, that's closer to us, so we're burning less fuel to get those products out there? Is that something you've thought about or heard about?
Yeah. So the focus of my research and really a lot of my work hasn't really focused on the end product. But, it's really kind of the point of agriculture is just like, where are you selling your product and is that being sold to a proper market? And a lot of what I've found is that farmers really are struggling getting a bang for their buck. It's very labor intensive, and sort of there isn't really a market right now for farming practices that are more ecologically beneficial. I mean, there's organic,
Okay.
but even organic is a label, isn't, something that is really very like focusing on the ecological benefits of farming practices. And there are some grants that are being distributed to farmers that have ecological practices, but those are, competitive and small. And
if they're national, federal level, they might be on the chopping block now. But
it's really looking like it.
Okay.
We need food, so hopefully the government knows. Hopefully the government knows that people need to eat and continue their businesses. But I'm not quite sure how that's being impacted so far.
Yeah, I mean that might be more of like a marketing question, communications. How do you package something? And I do know like the city. If you look up like the farmers markets, there's one like almost every day in a different neighborhood. So that's one outlet. I mean, how do we get people to be more interested in food that's more sustainable, more ecological? That's a whole other conversation. That's like, maybe we're not equipped for it.
Yeah. I did, in my research, I did find that the singer Jason Mraz, you might know him, he does have an agroforestry avocado farm in San Diego.
No way.
It's in Escondido. It's called Mraz Family Farms if you all want to stalk it.
Okay.
But they do sell a box of avocados. And, so there are 9 avocados in this box, and it costs $40.
Wow. Okay.
I don't know why. I'm not sure if it's the hype behind the name. I'm not sure if they really are factoring in all of the ecological benefits that they claim to have. But, the way that the market for agroforestry products or sort of like these ecologically benefit products is looking is sort of like your high-end buyer. You just sort of
like a chef in a really fancy restaurant.
Exactly.
Yeah. Where the menu doesn't have prices on it, and you sit down and you start freaking out, like, how am I going to pay for this?
Exactly. Which is a really stark contrast from the rest of the world because, like as we mentioned in Panama, people are using agroforestry practices to feed themselves and then sort of live sort of like these sustainable agriculture or like subsistence agriculture practices. And here in San Diego, it's sort of become a high-end market or niche.
Yeah. It's kind of a shame because you don't want those ecologically more oriented farms and produce to be associated with, well, this is just for the elite. This is just for the rich. Then it's like, okay, that's already a small group of people. That doesn't benefit your average person. Wow. I didn't think about that.
That's sort of my personal viewpoint on all of that.
We welcome personal views. This is Climate Talks. We welcome that. Well, Judy, you're going to be with this Climate Talk team at least for the rest of this year. We have our live event coming up in just a few weeks.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to add before we go? Anything you want to promo, etc., before we conclude this Climate Talk podcast, episode 5?
Yeah, I just really wanted to thank you for giving me a platform to sort of talk about my research, get to geek out on all things plants. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you. Well, as always, if you have a Climate Talks question, comment, critique, any kind of thing you want to send in to us, please go ahead and do so. Send us an email at climatetalksquestion@gmail.com. That is it for this, and we will see you next time.